The radar operator at the Bavar 373 battery outside Tabriz had been staring at a sterile, green screen for over 3 hours. It was a routine night shift, the kind of quiet that usually leads to boredom and heavy eyelids. The sky over Iran was supposed to be empty, but at exactly 02:31 local time, the screen didn't just flicker, it whispered. For half a second, a return appeared, then vanished, then pulsed back again. It was 40 kilometers deeper inside Iranian sovereign airspace than anything should ever be. This wasn't a ghost return or atmospheric noise. This was a physical object, and it had been moving through the most defended corridors of the country for nearly 40 minutes without a single sensor catching its trail. The operator felt the sudden cold rush of adrenaline. He wasn't looking at a drone or a stray civilian craft. He was looking at a shadow that shouldn't exist. He picked up the secure line to command, realizing in that moment that the impenetrable shield Iran had spent billions to build had just been bypassed. The mission had actually begun hours earlier, far from the Iranian border, at the Nevatim air base in the southern Israeli desert. There, a small, quiet detachment of F-22 Raptors had been forward deployed under the cover of routine exercises. The Pentagon's official language was, as always, intentionally dull. Rotational presence and regional interoperability. These are words chosen to say as little as possible about a deployment that says everything. You do not move the F-22, the world's most lethal air superiority fighter, into a combat theater for a routine flight. This aircraft has never been sold to an ally. It is a weapon the United States keeps entirely to itself. Its presence in the Middle East was a signal that a high-stakes signal intelligence operation was underway. The Americans weren't just flying. They were hunting for the electronic pulse of a nation. But as the operator in Tabriz watched that flickering dot, it became clear that the invisible jet had finally left a footprint. The hunt was no longer one-sided. For the first 40 minutes of the flight, the two F-22 Raptors were essentially ghosts moving through a digital graveyard. They didn't just fly over Iran, they dissected it. Their mission was deep signals intelligence, a term that sounds clinical but is incredibly dangerous in practice. Iran's air defense network had been modernizing at a pace that caught Western analysts off guard. The Bavar 373 system, Iran's answer to the Russian S-300 and S-400, was no longer a primitive mock-up. It was a layered architecture of sensors, many of them passive, meaning they don't emit a signal for the Raptor to find. They simply sit back and listen for the Raptor's own tiny electronic shadow. The F-22's sensor fusion suite and electronic warfare systems are designed to go exactly where satellites cannot. While a satellite can see a building from orbit, it cannot decode the specific pulse intervals or the handshake data links of a ground-based radar system hidden under a mountain. The Raptors were there to record every frequency, every heartbeat of the Iranian machine. They were pushing into the electromagnetic interior of the country, acting as a giant vacuum for data. The pilots were operating in total radio silence, communicating only through short, encrypted bursts that lasted mere milliseconds. They moved with a methodical, almost surgical patience, harvesting intelligence that would reshape the American military's understanding of Middle Eastern defenses for the next decade. Every turn they made was calculated to exploit gaps in the radar coverage, areas where the mountains blocked the line of sight, or where the Iranian operators were known to be less vigilant. It was the perfect mission, executed by the perfect machine. But perfection in warfare is a lie. Deep within the Iranian command structure, someone had been waiting for this exact category of intrusion. They hadn't been looking for a plane in the traditional sense. They were looking for the minute voids in the background radiation of the sky, and at 02:43 they found one. The order to scramble didn't come from a confused regional commander. It came from the top. At the Tabriz Air Base, 2 Iranian Air Force F-14A Tomcats began their takeoff roll before the Raptors even knew they had been spotted. The choice of the F-14 was not an accident. To any modern observer, the Tomcat is an ancient relic, a design from the 1970s that was famously featured in Top Gun. Most of the world's F-14s are in museums, but Iran has kept theirs alive through 4 decades of isolation, using black market parts and domestic engineering to keep the Persian cats in the air. Why use an old plane against a 5th-generation Raptor? Because the F-14 carries the AWG-9 radar, one of the most powerful mechanically scanned arrays ever built. It's a brute force radar. While modern radars try to be subtle, the AWG-9 is like a massive spotlight in a dark room. Furthermore, these Tomcats were armed with the Fakur 90, a reverse-engineered version of the American Phoenix missile. It's a long-range sniper weapon that demands respect, no matter how old the plane carrying it is. The Iranian pilots weren't rookies. They were the elite, trained to fly alert shifts specifically to counter Western stealth. Their mission was not a standard intercept. They weren't there to escort the Americans to the border or wave their wings in a friendly greeting. Their orders were aggressive: get between the Raptors and the border, deny any escape, and force a confrontation deep within Iranian territory. Tehran was tired of being poked and prodded. They wanted to prove that the age of uncontested penetration was over. As the Tomcats lit their massive afterburners and climbed into the freezing night air, the crews knew they were likely flying into a fight they couldn't win, but they only needed to be lucky once. They were carrying the pride of a nation on their wings, and they were heading straight for the ghosts that had violated their home. Inside the cockpits of the F-22 Raptors, the atmosphere changed instantly. The ALR-94 electronic warfare system, the jet's nervous system, had already painted a complete picture of the threat. The moment the F-14s turned on their radars at trees, the Raptors saw them. This is the fundamental asymmetry of modern air combat. In an old-school dogfight, you see the enemy and you turn to fight. In 5th-generation warfare, the Raptor sees the enemy's intent before the enemy even knows where the Raptor is. The American pilots didn't need to guess. They had high-fidelity tracking on the Tomcats while they were still climbing through 10,000 feet. The Raptors had firing solutions, essentially a guaranteed kill, on both Iranian aircraft before the Iranians had even leveled off. Yet the Raptor pilots were bound by strict rules of engagement. They were under orders: no offensive action unless fired upon. This created a bizarre high-stakes game of chicken at 30,000 feet. The Raptors began to maneuver toward the border, but they did so slowly, almost teasingly, drawing the F-14s further away from their ground support. The Iranian pilots were pushing their throttles to the firewall, their AWG-9 radars sweeping the sky with desperate intensity. On their scopes, the returns were maddening. The Raptors would appear for a split second, then dissolve into a cloud of electronic noise. It was like trying to catch smoke with a net. One moment, the target was at 12 o'clock. The next, it was gone, only to reappear 5 miles to the left. The Iranian crews were being guided more by vector and desperation than by any reliable track. They were chasing shadows that refused to stay still. But they were closing the gap. Pride and training kept them in the hunt. They knew that if they got close enough, even the most advanced stealth wouldn't matter. At a certain range, probability takes over. If you fire enough missiles into a small enough box of sky, you're gonna hit something. And as the distance closed to 65 nautical miles, the Iranian lead pilot decided he had seen enough. The call was made over a cracked, static-filled radio, Fox 3. 2 Fakur 90 missiles leaped off the rails of the lead F-14, their rocket motors illuminating the dark cockpit for a fraction of a second before they streaked away into the night. These missiles were racing northeast at nearly 4 times the speed of sound. At that moment, moment, the world was closer to a major international conflict than it had been in decades. But what happened next didn't involve explosions or dogfight maneuvers. It was a battle of ones and zeros. The engagement lasted roughly 11 seconds. The F-22's onboard computers had spent the entire flight profiling the Iranian radar. By the time the missiles went active, turning on their own internal radars to find the target, the Raptors were ready. The American jets didn't just use jamming, which is like shouting over someone's voice. They used surgical interference. They fed the missile's seekers a perfectly calibrated signal that made the Raptors appear to be 2 miles away from where they actually were. Simultaneously, the Raptors deployed timed chaff packages, tiny clouds of aluminum-coated glass fibers that bloomed in the sky. To the brain of the Fakir 90 missile, these chaff clouds looked like massive, juicy targets. The first missile bit the bait, turning sharply and detonating its proximity fuse against a cloud of tinsel. The second missile, confused by the digital ghost the Raptor was projecting, lost its guidance entirely. It went ballistic, becoming nothing more than a very expensive, unguided lawn dart. It fell through 10,000 feet of empty Iranian sky before crashing into the desert. The Raptors hadn't even broken a sweat. They were already crossing the Iraqi border, their stealth intact and their pilots calm. But the Iranians weren't alone in the sky anymore. The trap was about to be sprung from a direction they never expected. Just as the Iranian pilots realized their missiles had failed, the tone in their headsets changed. It wasn't the sound of their own radar anymore. It was the screaming of their radar warning receivers, RWR. They were being painted by multiple high-energy targeting radars from the west. Out over the eastern Mediterranean, the USS Gerald R. Ford had been lurking in the shadows. The moment the first Iranian missile launch was detected, a flight of F-35C Lightnings that had been running a silent patrol went to full military power. These jets didn't just join the fight, they materialized. For the F-14 crews, the situation went from frustrating to deadly in a heartbeat. On their scopes, they saw 2 new contacts, flickering with the same maddening stealth signatures as the Raptors. These F-35s were closing the distance at supersonic speeds, coming from the opposite direction and cutting off any hope of a second attack. The Iranian pilots were now sandwiched between 2 generations of American stealth. Their missiles were gone, their fuel was running low, and they were being targeted by aircraft they couldn't see from angles they couldn't counter. The F-35 pilots weren't broadcasting threats over the radio. They didn't need to. In the world of aerial warfare, geometry is the message. The way the F-35s were converging on the Tomcats told the Iranians everything they needed to know. The age of your supremacy is over. If you stay here, you die. The F-14 crews could feel the targeting solutions in their cockpits. They were being exposed in their own backyard. The arithmetic of the fight was merciless. With no missiles left and the Ford's entire air wing spinning up behind the F-35s, the Iranian pilots were forced to make the most humiliating decision of their careers. They broke their formation, turned their noses south, and ran for their lives back toward Tabriz. The F-35s held their position at the border, watching the legendary Persian cats shrink on their sensors until they were nothing more than fading dots on a screen. By 03:18, the sky over northwest Iran was quiet once again. Both Raptors were safely over Iraqi airspace, and by 03:49, they were touching down at Nevatim. Every pilot came home. The hard drives they carried were packed with the digital DNA of Iran's newest air defenses, data that would be analyzed by thousands of experts for months to come. The next morning, Iran's state media claimed a glorious victory. They told the world that their brave pilots had expelled the American intruders and defended their sovereignty. But in the halls of the Pentagon, there was only silence. This silence wasn't about restraint. It was the coldest way to deliver a message. Washington didn't need to issue a press release because they knew that the Iranian commanders knew exactly what had happened. They knew that their best missiles had just failed to even scratch the paint on an aircraft they could barely see. They knew that 2 F-35s had materialized from the west like a closing door, and they knew their best pilots had been forced to turn tail and run. The strategic reality this episode left behind is stark and terrifying for everyone in the region. Iran proved they can detect an F-22 under very specific, perfect conditions, a genuine achievement. But they also proved that detection and destruction are separated by a gap they cannot yet close. The F-22s sent a message before a single shot was fired. American fifth-generation power is not a theory. It is a physical, present reality parked on an Allied runway. Every actor in the Middle East, from the Gulf states to Hezbollah, noted the outcome of those 11 seconds. The sky may have been quiet by sunrise, but the balance of power had shifted. Both sides had looked directly at each other in the dark, and both sides walked away with the information they needed. The next encounter won't be a test, it will be a result. And in a region defined by escalation, this quiet night was just the calm before the storm.